This is a video on the PowerPoint of Kant and the Enlightenment period and argument for God. And this will be part one of the PowerPoint, which will cover the historical background information, the difference between the rationalists and the empiricists, Descartes, Berkeley, Locke, and Hume. So just skipping through Kant's life here. So Kant was a German philosopher, lived from 1724 to 1804, and that he probably never traveled more than 60 miles from his home, had a very rigid schedule. People could set their clocks by his daily walk. And of course, we've already talked about the categorical imperative that he came up with for his ethical theory. A bit of historical background information during the Enlightenment period. So there was a conflict between science and religion. That science and religion, they were not compatible. And at that time, the church was basically in charge of society through the monarchy. And so if anyone said anything that was against the church, against the teachings of the church, they had to be very careful not to do that, because otherwise they would get in serious trouble for going against the church. So the Enlightenment period, or the Age of Reason, is considered to be the late 17th century to the late 18th century, or the 1600s and the 1700s. It includes the following thinkers: René Descartes, John Locke, George Berkeley, and David Hume, of which I'll cover today so that you can understand the difference between the rationalists and the empiricists. So starting off with Descartes. And also let me go over what exactly is a rationalist. So a rationalist is basically the philosophers who claim that knowledge can be derived through pure reason or reason, that we don't always have to have empirical evidence to derive knowledge or to know about something, such as, for example, the topic of religion and the topic of God. So Descartes argued basically that we cannot rely upon our senses. So he was skeptical of the knowledge that can be derived through the senses. The senses can be deceiving. And he came up with several arguments to try to prove that. The first is the dream argument, in which sometimes when we're dreaming, we think that we are awake, and we do not realize we're dreaming until we actually wake up from the dream. And so that proves to us that our senses, in this case when we're dreaming, that it basically it fools us into believing that we are awake when in fact we're dreaming. Another argument is called the evil genius argument, and that is, imagine if there's this powerful supernatural being that has instilled upon us various false beliefs. For example, perhaps 1 plus 1 is equal, or for example, that 1 plus 1 is equal to 2. Maybe that's just a false belief instilled upon us by this evil genius. So how do we know that that's not the case? And therefore, what we think and what we know could be unreliable. Later, Descartes is going to argue for the God argument and how God exists, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Descartes said that, well, there's one thing I know for sure, and that is, if I think, therefore I exist. So as long as I am thinking, then I know that I must exist. So regardless of whether we're dreaming or we are awake, regardless of whether there's an evil genius, as long as we're thinking, then he concludes we must exist. So that's something that he knows for sure to be true. Descartes' philosophy is also known as Cartesian dualism, and dualism is basically the separation between the mind and the body, that the mind or the soul is immaterial. It is different from the material body. And Descartes had an argument for this. Why is it different? Because I can perceive myself existing without my body, but I cannot perceive myself existing without my mind. Therefore, my mind or the soul can exist independently of the body. So, of course, throughout history, the term mind is used interchangeably with the soul, or that the two are really in one and the same. Descartes came up with a clear and distinct argument, and that is basically whatever I can clearly distinctly perceive must be true. I can clearly and distinctly perceive in things such as God, therefore God must be true. So that was basically Descartes' argument as to how God exists, because Descartes can clearly and distinctly perceive in God, therefore God must actually exist. So moving on to Locke, who was an empiricist. So the definition of an empiricist is that anyone who claims that knowledge is derived through sense experience, or that there has to be evidence for whatever we believe in. So he rejected innate principles and innate ideas that we're not born with knowledge. The mind is a tabula rasa at birth. We acquire knowledge through experience. There is no universal consent. That is to say, things they don't exist out there independent of us, basically. And that is also no absolute truth, or at least truth is not universal and exists outside of us, and it is definitely not innate. We're not born with any sort of truth as well. However, John Locke does not deny in innate capacities, that is, certain innate abilities. For example, let's say you have an innate ability to draw or to be creative. So that's considered as an innate capacity. So knowledge is from experience, and knowledge is from sensation and reflection as well. Reflection is basically perception, thinking, doubting, believing, reasoning, knowing, willing, and all the different actings of our minds. We have ideas, and ideas is whatever the mind perceives in itself or is the immediate object or of perception, thought, or understanding. That I call an idea. So basically, whatever the mind is focused upon, that's the definition of an idea. Locke distinguishes between primary and secondary qualities. So primary qualities are basically things about an object that actually exists as a part of the object. And Locke gives us some examples such as solidity, extension, figure, motion or rest, and number. So for example, if we take a piece of paper, a white piece of paper, for example, 8.5 by 11. The 8.5 by 11 is its dimension. For example, the quantity is one piece of paper. And so Locke would say its extension or its size dimension, and also the number of the piece of paper, that really exists as a part of the nature of the piece of paper. The secondary qualities, Locke says that these are not really inside the objects themselves. It's just merely a perception, such as color, sound, taste. That is to say, secondary qualities can change. They're not permanent. They're not a part of the object. They're not really there, in other words. So when we take an example of the white piece of paper, if we turn all the lights off in that room, then the paper is no longer white. And that's why Locke considers color as a secondary quality, not a primary quality. Same thing with sound and taste. For example, when we're sick, it changes the taste of things. And that's why Locke would say taste isn't really inside the objects, it's just a matter of our own personal perception. Moving on to Berkeley and back to Berkeley as being an example of a rationalist. Another term for this is idealist. Idealists people are people who believe, for example, that God must really exist, and there doesn't have to be any empirical evidence to say that God exists. So Berkeley is an extreme rationalist or idealist, and says that all knowledge are simply ideas. Everything that we know is simply an idea, right? And if we really think about this, this is not false at all. That everything is an idea, and an idea is inside of our brain or our mind. So the external world, we know of the external world, but we know it in the form of an idea. That's how we know it. And Berkeley went on to say that as far as saying, well, I don't know if anything out there exists. All I know are the ideas that I have inside my mind. This includes ideas of the external world, ideas of myself, and the idea of God as well. Essence is perception, right? That is to say, as long as I perceive of something or someone perceives of it, then it must exist. So existence is perception. And then, which brings into a few examples here. For example, if you are inside a classroom and everyone leaves the classroom, does that mean that the classroom disappears? Does it mean that it does not exist? Because that's basically the implication of what Berkeley is saying. If no one is around to perceive of it, then it doesn't exist. If a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to perceive of it, then does that mean that it didn't really happen? If we go to sleep and we're not dreaming, does it mean that we flicker in and out of existence? So this is sort of some of the problems that have been brought up with regards to Berkeley's philosophy. Now, Berkeley would respond by saying, well, actually, there is a mind out there that is always existing and perceives of everything at all time, and that is the mind of God. So God perceives of the room at all times. God perceives of the trees in the forest at all times. God perceives of us at all times. Therefore, everything must exist because God perceives of everything at all times. Then moving over to David Hume, who was a extreme empiricist, and basically Hume said that anything that does not have any empirical or scientific evidence behind it is basically nonsense, right? That it is not true if you cannot somehow prove of it empirically or scientifically. So Hume is basically just a very extreme version of an empiricist. Going back to the Enlightenment period here. So the aim from the rationalists is to explain fundamental religious beliefs such as God and the soul in the same rational manner as the empiricists. And this is how we get the God arguments, pretty much, right? That the God arguments are rational attempts to explain how and why God must exist. the problems with empirical reasoning. So Kant says, or would say, that empirical reasoning cannot explain certain things. And those would be, for example, the possibility of miracles, of the creation or divine intervention of any sort, of God, and as far as free will as well, because Kant believes that everything in this world, or in this world, we are subject to what is called the law of universal causality. And let me show that on the next slide here, right here, the law of universal causality. And that is to say that in this world, in this reality, supposedly everything has a cause. Everything has a cause. And so we can trace everything back to something else. And if this is the case, then there is no such thing as free will. If everything is caused by something else, the perception that we have free will is that implies that we don't, because everything that we do is caused by something else, and we can trace it back to something else. And therefore, we don't really have free will. In other words, free will would imply that there's no cause to everything, that we can act instantaneously to do something without any particular reason behind it. So that's the implication of why Kant would say that empirical reasoning cannot explain free will either. And free will is required for us to act morally for Kant, right? That's in his philosophy. And so if we can't explain free will using empiricism, if we cannot explain how God can exist through empiricism, these are simply not acceptable to Kant. And therefore the goal of Kant's philosophy, is to prove that God exists, and also to prove that free will exists, and also to disprove and refute Hume's skepticism with regards to the foundation of science and really basic scientific evidence as well. So that's the end of part 1, and in the next video I will show part 2 of Kant's philosophy and what Kant has to say about a noumena-phenomena distinction and the interrelationship between God, the afterlife, the highest good, reason, free will, and morality.